preserve life that mankind has succeeded in inventing in place of what it's worth living for it. In other words, putting its idealism in place of its ideal condition. Living for something is the permanent principle of the in. And so that sounds to me like the Romantic's curse. The Romantic's curse is where we have an ideal and something we want to achieve, but because we're a romantic, that means we have to keep desire always alive, so we keep putting it just out of arm's length. Whereas, Agata asks emphatically, it says, what is this in? And then, he shrugs his shoulders and attempts, some definition, but then the narration says there was no doubt that Ulrich was evading a decision, and unfortunately to live in something remains unanswered. But these pages 1494 through 1497, this is an amazing discourse or dialectic on living for versus living in something, and this is all stemming from some of his criticism of Lindner. Obviously there's some jealousy, but he's also looking at him and criticizing the way he's choosing to live for religion and not in religion. There is this incredible poetic section about the island of health. This whole island of health section, it tells us in the note that Clarissa flees to Italy, where she joins Ulrich on the island of health. So now Clarissa and Ulrich are together alone on this island of health. Who knows what Walter's up to? Who knows what Agata's up to? Probably spending time with Lindner. I don't know. But we get this very, just really good writing. And really symbolic writing where stones represent Ulrich and a fork or a branch, meaning like a fork in a branch rather, and then holes in the sand represent Clarissa. But it says whenever she scratched her thoughts and emotions in the sand. And then the island became populated with many Clarissas. They slept on the sand, flew on the light through the air, called from the throats of birds. And so she's here on this island of health trying to get better. She's been in an institution at this point, but she's seeing herself as propagating wildly into all these different Clarissas. As she's scratching her thoughts in the sand, every grain of sand is becoming a Clarissa. As water's evaporating into the air, as birds are taking in this air and chirping, these are just Clarissas upon Clarissas. And Ulrich is sitting here and observing these things. He's thinking about Emerson. He's thinking about Nietzsche. He's thinking thoughts such as to leave a trace in the world, to erect in the world a monument to oneself, a deed that will still be celebrated after hundreds of years, is the meaning of all heroism. I have done something. That is a trace, a dissimilar but immortal portrait. I have done something binds parts of the material world to myself. So remember again that new empiricist psychology that Ryan is pointing out in her book about the I becoming one with the world, becoming all of it conflated together. But then Clarissa, meanwhile, was playing out her game of signs. Basically, it was only the exaggerated form of this having to imprint oneself on uncertainty. And so the world is becoming a very uncertain place for Clarissa, and she's having to imprint herself, hence the multiplicity of Clarissas. On page 1630, we get the visit to the Madhouse. This is my absolute favorite section of the entire production. Published and unpublished work. The entire 2-volume production that we have is without a doubt the visit to the Madhouse. This is where we see Musil at his highest level of authorship. What's happening here is we have Dr. Freudenthal bringing Clarissa into a room to meet with Moosbrugger for the first time. She's attempted this several times, I think up to 3 times, and this is the fourth time's a charm in this point, but there are four men sitting around the table. This is a very Dostoevskian production here. It reminds me of his examinations of sin and guilt and justice and so on. But we have this scene where we have four men sitting at a table as Freudenthal and Clarissa are entering. There's the criminal himself, Musbrugger, and he's just sitting there in everyday clothes. Then you have the doctor, and this is Dr. Pfeiffer, a visiting doctor, and he has on a white physician's smock. You have a priest, and he's sitting there in a threadbare cassock. And then the intern there, who is in a business suit. And so we get this scene where we've got this, Musil has set it up to where we're going to get many different perspectives of Musbrugger, of his crime, of the criminality, of justice, of sin and guilt, in one scene. And it says that these figures sat around the table and aside from their wooden chairs, the room was empty except for 3 high windows. And that's interesting. This is a personification of these windows because the room is empty except for windows. I would never look into an empty room and say, the room actually isn't empty. It has 3 high windows. But we see that just a few pages later, these windows are personified. And it says, this is Freudenthal, I sometimes feel as if the windows of this building were nothing more than magnifying glasses. And so now we see that these windows are magnifying the scene here. They are, in a sense, a type of jury. Musbrugger stood up straight and gallantly came up to her. Freudenthal introduced him too, and Musbrugger took her unsteady hand in his paw and made a quick, silent bow like a big adolescent. In this one sentence, Musil deftly captures and paints this scene for us. Here we are, look how much of this book we've read to this point. And now we're finally getting Clarissa in front of Musbrugger. He stood straight up, gallantly came up to her. Musbrugger took her unsteady hand. Clarissa is now nervous. In his paw, we're using the word paw. He's an animal. The paw is much bigger than her little unsteady hand. And he made a quick, silent bow like a big adolescent. And so there's this, in one person, there's this horrible monster. There's this, Clarissa's double being of this big, horrible monster with this enormous body, but then this meek little adolescent. Freudenthal starts to speak of Pfeiffer. According to the opinion of our esteemed guest, Dr. Pfeiffer, he said with a soothing glance and smile, no one is capable of deciding whether a person is guilty. We doctors can't because guilt, being held accountable for one's actions, and all those things aren't medical concepts at all. And judges can't because without some knowledge of the important connections between body and mind, there is no way of arriving at a judgment about such questions either. It's only religion that unambiguously demands personal responsibility before God for every sin. So ultimately, such questions always become questions of religious conviction. With these last words, he had directed his smile at the pastor, hoping by this teasing to give the conversation a harmless turn. Now, here's a curveball from Clarissa. But suddenly Clarissa said, perhaps the patient is here because he is standing in for someone else. And this completely takes them off their guard for a second. It throws them off. Dr. Pfeiffer, regains composure and comes in with, that's not entirely so. We can't even talk clearly about what it means to say, I'm speaking as a doctor, and, leads it back into that. But then we get this image of Musbrugger tensing and then relaxing, and it says that A patronizing smile could be discerned on Musburger's face for quite some time. It slowly faded in his absorption in the game of cards. The way pleats in a stiff material soften with constant use. Beautiful imagery. These men sitting around him, these judges, if you will, were surreptitiously observing Musburger. But Musburger, unsuspecting, was observing her, Clarissa. From time to time, he furtively directed his eyes at her and tried to surprise and hold her glance. So he's warming up to her presence now, and Musil is working this thing up so that we can feel Clarissa's sort of thrill and fear mixed together. The doctor complained gently, the human science is developed at different times and for different purposes, which have nothing to do with each other. So we have the most divergent concepts about the same thing. Pfeiffer equates Musburger with a hunter, and Clarissa says he hunts them. Clarissa asks in a choked voice. Her composure is crumbling during this entire scene. Yes, you could almost say he's a hunter in love with his prey. And so what eventually follows is that Clarissa makes a move to basically get Freudenthal to get her the heck out of that room. She's starting to fall under the weight of the whole thing. She feels herself to be prey, put out there as bait by these men to see what Musburger will do. She can feel Musburger's confidence and power beginning to loom up. And she and Freudenthal end up going out, and she says, "You don't have the slightest doubt that the man is sick.